The sun blazed down over the town of Silver Creek, turning the dirt streets into ribbons of gold and dust. Wagons rattled, cattle bellowed, and the smell of sweat, leather, and gun oil hung heavy in the noon air. The auction yard was alive with noise, men shouting bids, boots scraping against the boards, and the sharp crack of the auctioneer's gavel echoing like gunfire. In the midst of that chaos stood Evelyn Grace, a young woman barely past 20, her bonnet shadowing eyes that had known too much loss for her years. She clutched a small leather pouch close to her chest, the last of her father's savings, the last piece of a life that had crumbled like dust in the wind. Her heart thudded beneath her worn dress as she looked at the small herd of cattle in the pen. They were thin, scrappy things, but they meant survival. If she could buy even 2 or 3, maybe, just maybe, she could keep the old ranch from dying completely. The auctioneer called out a price, his voice booming over the restless crowd. Evelyn hesitated, then lifted her trembling hand. For a heartbeat, everything froze. Then came the laughter. It rolled over her like thunder off, mocking voices dripping with scorn. "Ain't that cute?" someone shouted. "Little lady thinks she's a rancher." Others snickered. "Maybe she's looking for a husband, not cattle." Her face burned as the laughter grew. Tears stung her eyes, but she refused to lower her hand. She wanted to speak, to shout that she had as much right as any man there, but her throat locked tight. And then, without a word, he stepped forward, a tall cowboy, quiet and weathered, his hat pulled low and dust clinging to his coat. He didn't look at the crowd, didn't speak a syllable. He simply reached out, took Evelyn's trembling hand, and raised it higher for all to see. The laughter died instantly. A hush swept the yard, heavy and strange. Every eye turned to the cowboy, whose calm, gray gaze met the auctioneer's. The hammer hovered midair, and for one breathless moment, the world seemed to forget how to breathe. That was the moment Evelyn Grace's story truly began, the moment a stranger's silent courage shattered the cruel laughter of Silver Creek. Silver Creek wasn't the kind of town that offered mercy. It was carved out of dust and stubbornness, a place where the strong built fences and the weak were buried beyond them. The wind carried more gossip than kindness, and respect was measured not by the goodness of a person's heart, but by how many acres of land they could claim or how many heads of cattle bore their brand. At the far edge of that prideful town sat what was left of the Grace homestead, a few acres of dry pasture, a leaning barn, and a house that creaked in the night like it was remembering better days. Evelyn had grown up there, her father once a respected rancher, until drought and debt broke him. When he passed, the land went quiet, like it, too, was grieving. All that remained was his daughter alone, penniless, and determined to hold on to the little piece of him the land represented. Silver Creek didn't think much of her. Men in the saloon whispered that she'd sell the place within a month. Women at the general store watched her with pity, shaking their heads when she bought nails instead of bread. But Evelyn had her father's grit. Each sunrise found her in the fields, sleeves rolled, working until her hands blistered and her back ached. And somewhere beyond town, Luke Carver rode the backcountry trails, a quiet drifter with eyes like the edge of steel, and a past no one dared ask about. He spoke little, drank less, and carried an air of quiet danger. To most, he was just another loner passing through. But to Evelyn Grace, he was fast becoming something far more, an unanswered question. The desert wind refused to explain. The laughter from that first auction still echoed in Evelyn's ears long after the crowd had dispersed. She stood rooted in place, cheeks flushed with shame, clutching the little pouch of coins that suddenly felt worthless. Around her, men swaggered and boasted of their winnings, while others cast smirks her way as if her failure were the day's true entertainment. Among them was Clayton Boone, son of the richest cattle baron in Silver Creek, a man who had inherited power without earning it, and cruelty without apology. Clayton had seen her lift her hand that day, and instead of ignoring her, he'd chosen to make sport of it. "What's next?" he'd sneered loud enough for all to hear. "You planning to drive cattle yourself, sweetheart? Maybe cook a supper while you're at it." The men around him laughed, the sound sharp as spurs striking stone. But when Luke Carver stepped forward, silent, steady, his hand raising Evelyn's in quiet defiance, the laughter faltered. Clayton's smile stiffened, then faded altogether. The drifter's calm eyes met his, holding that gaze until Boone looked away. It was a small victory, but one that stung the pride of a man who was used to commanding fear. After that day, the whispers began. Folks in Silver Creek wondered aloud why a loner like Luke would stand up for a broke girl no one respected. Some said he pitied her. Others claimed there was something unspoken between them. Either way, Luke's quiet act had marked them both. And in a town built on pride, that mark was as dangerous as blood on sand. Days turned into weeks, and the laughter from that auction faded only in sound, not in memory. Evelyn returned to the Grace Ranch, a weary stretch of land that seemed to sigh under the weight of drought and disappointment. The fields were cracked and thirsty, the fences half-rotten, and the barn leaned as if one strong wind could send it tumbling. Each morning, she rose before dawn, her hands blistered and raw from the work her father once made look effortless. She mended fences, hauled water from the dry creek bed, and whispered small prayers over the dusty soil, hoping anything might take root. The townsfolk watched her struggle from afar. In the saloon, men placed bets on how long she'd last before giving up. A month, maybe 2, they'd chuckle between sips of whiskey. But Evelyn heard every word when she went into town for supplies, the whispers following her like shadows. Still, she kept her head high. Pride was all she had left. Sometimes, in the cool of evening, a familiar figure would appear on horseback near the fence line. Luke Carver. He never said much, just tipped his hat, fixed a post, or left a sack of grain without explanation. She'd offer thanks. He'd nod once and ride off before the sun dipped below the hills. Yet each silent visit left her heart lighter, steadier. But not everyone took kindly to the drifter's quiet kindness. Word reached Clayton Boone, whose wounded pride festered into resentment. And resentment, in Silver Creek, had a way of turning mean like the desert before a storm. The night it happened, the sky above Silver Creek was moonless, thick with clouds and silence. Evelyn had been asleep only a few hours when the smell of smoke clawed its way through her dreams. Her eyes flew open. In an instant, she was out of bed, barefoot on the cold floorboards, heart hammering. Outside, an orange glow flickered against the walls. The barn was on fire. She ran into the yard, the wind whipping her hair and the flames roaring like a beast awakened. Her few cattle bawled in terror, crashing through the corral as the blaze consumed the dry wood. Evelyn grabbed a bucket, then froze at the sound of hooves. Not the wild gallop of frightened stock, these were deliberate, circling, closing in. Before she could call out, a gunshot split the night. A bullet struck the fence post inches from her head, splintering wood. Shadows on horseback emerged from the dark. 3 men, faces hidden by bandanas. One laughed low. "Should have stayed in town where you belong, girl." She turned to run, but rough hands caught her arm. Then came another sound, a single rifle crack from the ridge, clean and sharp. One of the riders fell. The others wheeled around as Luke Carver thundered into the yard, firing as he rode. The fight was fierce, brief, and blinding, gunfire flashing, hooves pounding, smoke choking the air. When it was over, the attackers fled into the desert, and Luke slumped from his saddle, blood seeping through his sleeve. Evelyn dropped beside him, trembling. As she pressed a rag to his wound, tears mixed with soot on her face. For the first time, she realized his silence had never meant indifference. It had been devotion, spoken in the only language the frontier respected, sacrifice. For 2 days, the wind outside howled through the canyons while Evelyn tended to Luke's wound. She set up a cot near the fireplace, changing his bandages by lantern light as the flames painted his face in gold and shadow. He rarely spoke, but fever made him restless, and in those half-dreaming hours, his guard slipped. Words escaped that he never meant her to hear, names, regrets, fragments of another life. When his strength returned, he finally told her the truth. Years ago, Luke Carver hadn't been a drifter at all. He'd owned land north of Silver Creek, a proud rancher with a family name worth something. But that was before Henry Boone, Clayton's father, had taken it all. A crooked loan, a forged signature, and one bad season later, Luke lost everything. He'd fought back once with a gun, and a man had died for it. Since then, he'd carried the weight of that moment in silence, living as a shadow of the man he once was. Evelyn listened without judgment, her eyes steady on his. "You didn't lose everything," she said softly. You just forgot what was worth keeping." Her words struck deeper than any wound. And as dawn broke, painting the land in fragile light, they made a pact not to seek revenge, but to reclaim what was rightfully theirs. The next auction was coming. For both of them, it wasn't just about cattle anymore, it was about redemption. The morning of the next auction dawned bright and windless, the kind of day that made every sound carry across the valley. Evelyn walked down the main street of Silver Creek with her chin lifted, boots kicking up little clouds of dust. The same townsfolk who once laughed now fell quiet as she passed, curiosity mixing with disbelief. By her side walked Luke Carver, his hat low, his expression unreadable, but his presence alone sent whispers rippling through the crowd, like wind through tall grass. When they reached the auction yard, Clayton Boone was already there, leaning against the corral fence with that same crooked grin. "Back again, Miss Grace?" he drawled. "I thought we taught you your place last time." His eyes flicked to Luke. "Or did your hired gun come to save you again?" Evelyn didn't flinch. "I'm not here to be saved," she said evenly. "I'm here to buy." The auctioneer began calling bids, his hammer gleaming in the sun. Clayton raised his hand instantly, throwing out numbers just to make her squirm. But Evelyn didn't waver. With every increase, Luke's quiet voice followed, calm and certain, backing her with every last coin he owned. The crowd leaned in, the tension thick as gunpowder. Finally, the price reached a breaking point. Clayton hesitated, too proud to lose, too greedy to win. The gavel came down. Sold. A stunned silence swept the yard. No laughter this time. Just the sight of a woman standing tall beside a man who had once lost everything, and together they just bought back their dignity. Weeks turned into months, and the Grace Ranch began to breathe again. Grass returned to the pastures after a rare spring rain. Fences stood firm, and the sound of cattle lowing in the distance replaced the lonely creak of empty wind. Evelyn worked from dawn to dusk, her hands rough and strong, her spirit unbroken. But she was no longer alone. Luke was there, mending gates, breaking colts, and sometimes just sitting beside her on the porch as the sun bled red across the horizon. The townsfolk's laughter had quieted. Where once they saw a foolish girl, they now saw a woman who'd stood her ground. Men who'd mocked her tipped their hats as she passed. Even Clayton Boone, stripped of his arrogance and drowning in his father's debts, rode by in silence, unable to meet her eyes. One evening, as twilight settled like a soft blanket over the land, Luke leaned against the fence, watching the cattle graze. "You did it," he murmured. Evelyn smiled faintly. "We did." He turned to her then, the dying light catching in his gray eyes. "Then let's keep building it together. No ring, no grand gesture, just a promise spoken quiet and true." And as the wind carried their laughter across the open plains, the horizon finally felt like home. The story fades into the hush of twilight, the image of Evelyn and Luke standing side by side beneath the wide western sky. The dust has settled, the laughter long gone, and what remains is quiet courage, the kind that changes everything without ever asking for praise. And now, the question passes to you. Would you have raised her hand when the whole town laughed? Would you have stood up for someone everyone else turned away from, or would you have stayed silent, watching from the crowd? Sometimes it takes only one moment of bravery to turn another person's life around. One small act that echoes forever across the plains of the human heart. The music fades, and the question lingers. Out here in the Wild West, courage didn't always come with a gun or a shout. Sometimes it wore dust on its boots and spoke only in quiet deeds. Luke Carver's courage wasn't the kind that sought glory, it was the kind that stood beside the fallen, lifted them up, and faced the world without fanfare. And Evelyn Grace's strength wasn't loud or defiant, it was the kind that refused to break, even when the world tried to shame her into silence. Together, they proved a truth the frontier has always known. True courage doesn't always roar. It whispers in the hearts of those who choose compassion over cruelty and honor over pride. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like the video, share it with someone who believes in quiet courage, and subscribe for more tales of the Wild West, where every heart has its own frontier.